Welcome to This Explainer. You know, I am so thrilled you're here today because we are diving into the incredibly dramatic, bloody, and, honestly, entirely misunderstood life of one of America's most famous figures. We're looking at a man whose name is recognized worldwide, yet the truth of his life is often buried under an absolute mountain of pop culture mythology. Okay, let's jump right into this. The rise, fall, and myth of an antihero, Jesse James.
So how exactly does a teenage soldier evolve into a notorious, heavily mythologized social bandit? Well, today, we're going to deconstruct that entire journey. We'll trace his path from riding with Confederate guerrillas as a teenager to leading the feared James Younger gang across the Midwest, right up to a disastrous bank raid in Minnesota, his shocking assassination, and the enduring cultural legacy he left behind.
Right. So to get a real grip on who Jesse James was, we have to start at the beginning, in what was essentially a crucible of war.
You literally can't understand the Outlaw without understanding the incredibly brutal environment that shaped him, the Missouri frontier during the American Civil War. Picture this. It's the spring of 1864, and a lanky 16-year-old Jesse James joins a completely bloodthirsty group of pro-Confederate bushwhackers led by a guy known as Bloody Bill Anderson. And you've got to realize, the Missouri frontier wasn't your standard battlefield. It totally lacked any traditional military codes of conduct, which led to the normalization of some really extreme atrocities. I mean, by the time he was just 16, Jesse was participating in horrific events like the Centralia Massacre, where 22 unarmed Union soldiers and over 100 others were completely butchered. To really drive home the gravity of this, historian Tom Goodrich notes that, quote, fearful atrocities were committed. Scalpings, decapitations, mutilations, mind-boggling atrocities, end quote. It's intense, right? But this is the exact crucible that completely desensitized a teenage boy to extreme violence. It laid a very real, very violent foundation for the man he was about to become.
Okay, fast forward a bit. The war ends, and this brings us to the James Younger gang, where the motive really shifted to profit over patriotism.
See, when the Civil War ended, a lot of soldiers just went back to their farms, put down their weapons, and tried to move on. But not Jesse and his older brother Frank. No, they decided to weaponize the skills they'd learned. Now, they crafted this whole Robin Hood myth for themselves, claiming they were noble victims of post-war disenfranchisement, just stealing from Northern radical Republicans to defend Southern sympathizers. But the objective historical reality? It was completely different. They were driven by personal profit and revenge, plain and simple. They robbed Southern banks just as readily as Northern ones, and they ruthlessly murdered unarmed cashiers along the way. And the sheer scale of their operation, it was staggering. We're talking about a highly organized, massively lucrative crime spree that spanned multiple states over an entire decade. $12,000 in Kentucky, $30,000 from a train in Kansas. To put that into perspective, those were astronomical amounts of money in the 1870s. This absolutely wasn't some ragtag group of rebels. It was a highly profitable, highly lethal crime syndicate. So how exactly did they execute these strikes? Take the 1873 Airedale train robbery, for example. This was actually the very first train robbery west of the Mississippi River. They derailed a locomotive, killing the engineer, John Rafferty, in a terrible crash, just to steal a little over $2,000. But here's the really crucial detail. They wore Ku Klux Klan masks during the raid. The Klan had recently been suppressed by President Grant, so the gang wore these masks as a deliberate, terrifying symbol of rebellion against federal centralization. But that begs the question, how on earth did a gang of brutal thieves become so beloved by the public? Well, for the first time, newspapers were actually mentioning Jesse James by name, and he absolutely loved the attention. Actually, soon after, he began tailoring his robbery specifically to attract as much press as possible. He'd even leave press releases behind. Jesse James was a master manipulator of the media. He actively crafted his own narrative, essentially turning a criminal enterprise into a populist performance.
But of course, every streak has to end. And that brings us to the ultimate turning point, the disastrous raid in Northfield, Minnesota. By 1876, after operating with near impunity across the Midwest, Jesse kind of began to believe in his own invulnerability, and he was about to overreach in a major way that would destroy his gang. On September 7, 1866, in Northfield, the gang traveled way outside their usual territory. The timeline is wild.
At 1 p.m., innocent bystanders, including some newly arrived Swedish immigrants, are just milling about town. At 2 p.m., 3 gang members confidently stroll into the First National Bank. But mid-raid, everything falls apart. The citizens of Northfield realize what's going down, and they literally arm themselves. By 2:07 p.m., just 7 minutes later if you can believe it, 2 robbers are dead in the street, and the shattered gang is fleeing for their lives. The alarm was actually sounded by a local merchant named J.S. Allen. I want you to just imagine the sheer adrenaline on the street as he shouted, quote, "Get your guns, boys, they're robbing the bank," end quote. This was the exact moment ordinary citizens refused to be victims. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find and fought back against America's most feared outlaws. And, the heroism inside the bank was just as incredible. The acting cashier, Joseph Lee Heywood, flat out refused to open the safe. He stood his ground even with a Bowie knife to his throat and a pistol to his head. Tragically, it cost him his life when a frustrated robber shot him. But it perfectly contrasts the incredible courage of an everyday citizen against the stark brutality of the James Younger gang. So, what did the gang actually get for all this bloodshed and for losing their own men? A shockingly low $26.70. Yeah, $26. Just a few bags of nickels grabbed off a table. The Northfield Raid was a complete, catastrophic failure for the Outlaws. And that catastrophe immediately triggered the largest manhunt in U.S. history up to that point. 2 weeks later, the Younger brothers and Charlie Pitts were cornered in a swamp. Pitts was killed, the heavily wounded Youngers surrendered and pleaded guilty. Frank and Jesse? Well, they managed to escape across the Dakotas, but make no mistake, the core James Younger gang was permanently destroyed.
Now we move into the final, frankly paranoid chapter of his life, leading to his eventual fall.
Following Northfield, Jesse lived this restless, totally paranoid existence. He tried to form a new gang, but the political climate had completely changed. During Frank James's later trial, the prosecutor stated that the James brothers led young men to, quote, lives of shame and bloodshed. The myth of the noble Southern hero was fracturing fast. To a lot of folks, they weren't heroes anymore. They were corrupting predators who dragged local farm boys into violent early graves. And the authorities were finally ready to end it for good. The governor of Missouri, Thomas Crittenden, colluded with railroad and express companies to place an absolutely massive $10,000 bounty on Jesse James. $10,000? This huge reward set the stage for the ultimate betrayal, right from within Jesse's own inner circle. So, here is how it all ended on April 3rd, 1882. Jesse is hiding out in St. Joseph, Missouri, under an assumed name. He's so incredibly paranoid that he has new recruits, Robert and Charlie Ford, move in just to protect him. But Robert Ford has already made a secret deal with the governor for that reward money. And then, in this remarkably mundane moment, Jesse uncharacteristically takes off his revolvers, he stands on a chair to dust a picture, and right then, Robert Ford shoots the unarmed outlaw in the back of the head. Which leads us to look at the enduring legend he left behind. Was he a martyr or just a murderer? Jesse was dead at just 34 years old, but his myth, it was just taking on a life of its own. Pop culture was about to completely transform his objective historical crimes into this lasting mythology. Formal academic analyses, like a great thesis from Andrews University, examine the cultural history of Jesse James on film. I mean, the fact that universities formally study his legacy shows just how deeply embedded he is in our culture. Through dime novels, movies, literature, society has constantly reshaped his story, twisting him into an anti-hero that reflects the hopes and the prejudices of whatever generation is telling the tale. And this brings up a really crucial psychological pivot. You see, it was the absolute cowardice of Robert Ford's betrayal, shooting an unarmed man in the back while he was literally just doing chores in his own home, that acted as the catalyst for Jesse's transformation into an American martyr. Because he died in such a treacherous, backhanded way, the public began to view him sympathetically. And somehow that sympathy overrode a lifetime of brutal, indiscriminate murders. But as we wrap up this explainer, let's synthesize the actual reality we're leaving behind. The facts are clear. Jesse James was shaped by the extreme, lawless violence of the Civil War frontier. He took those brutal skills and commanded a lethal, highly profitable crime syndicate. He masterfully manipulated the press to shield his gang behind this social bandit persona. And ultimately, his downfall wasn't brought about by some grand army, but by ordinary, everyday citizens in a small Minnesota town who bravely decided to fight back. Which leaves us with one final provocative question. Was Jesse James a tragic product of a uniquely violent frontier, or was he simply a ruthless criminal cleverly cloaked in a lost cause? I'll leave you to weigh that myth against the violent reality we just unpacked. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the source material. Stay curious, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.